so we're in Luke chapter 10. And like I said, this first parable is kind of one that we've heard of before. It's the Good Samaritan. I'm going to get so messed up. I normally just print on the front. I have front and back. And so I'm going to do like all over the place. Okay, let's see here. All right, so just like we always approach it, what section do we find this parable in? Journey section. So this is the largest section in Luke. That's your first blank. Do we get all the outline? Do I need to go over? Or are we just so smart now? We know it. Prologue is the beginning section. And then we have the pre-public life. And that's where we find like the birth of Jesus and John the Baptist. We get the Christmas story there. Then section 3, we have the Galilean ministry. So we see his work up in that region in the north. And then our section tonight is the journey to Jerusalem section. Like I said, it's the largest section in Luke. The 5th section is the entrance to Jerusalem. And then the final section is the Passion of the Son of Man, which is his betrayal, arrest, crucifixion, and resurrection. So this section is largely unique to Luke. Do you remember what that means when I say it's unique? When we're talking about Gospels.
His audience?
Nope, that's good though, because he does have a
Nobody
unique
else.
audience.
Nobody else covers the same material.
Yeah, so when we talk about what is unique in that, it's what Luke is writing that is not shared between the other synoptics. So Matthew, Mark, when you read them, they seem very similar, right? John's different, he's doing his own thing. But the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, they're very similar. And it sounds like you're reading the exact same stories. And sometimes you are. And sometimes there's just maybe different situations going on with Jesus doing the same teaching. But in this section, this is a big chunk of Luke's writing that's unique to him that you don't see in Matthew or in Mark. So Mark, though, and this is why I mentioned it, we're not really looking at a lot of his parables because he has only one that's unique to him. He shares between both Luke and Matthew. And there's all kinds of theories on why that is. There's like Q theory and all that stuff, but we won't get into that tonight. But that's what it means when it's unique. And so you won't find the Good Samaritan story in Mark or in Matthew because it's going to be unique to him. This section functions to build suspense as Jesus travels to Jerusalem to die. And we've talked about that since we've started the Gospel of Luke, that this large section in 9:51 talks about he kind of sets his gaze. He faces Jerusalem and he's determined to go to Jerusalem because that's where he's going to pay for sin and conquer death. And so then the whole story is just building the suspense as he's going to Jerusalem to die. All right, so our parable begins at verse 30. Jesus replied and said, "A man's going down from Jerusalem to Jericho." So that's where the parable begins, but what is our lead-in to the parable? So we always want to back up and find the context. Why is Jesus even talking about this story or giving this parable?
25. Rejection by a liar?
Rejection or a question? A question.
The religious lawyer was querying him.
Yes. So Luke 10:25, a lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" So that's kind of our lead-in, because then Jesus is going to address him and then give a parable. Kind of more context, though, and we saw this Sunday, if you were here at church, JB talked about the 70 sent out, or the 72, whichever, and you have these these woes up in Chorazin, Bethsaida, Capernaum, and then, and starting in verse 17, the 70 return, and they're all happy about the ability to cast out demons and all this stuff. And then in verse 20, Jesus says, "Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are recorded in heaven." So there's kind of this context where Jesus is saying, this is what's really important, is that your name is recorded in heaven, meaning you have eternal life. And so then he talks and praises God, and then I think that's what initiates the lawyer's question. He's saying, your names are written and recorded in heaven, and so the lawyer's like, what must I do then to have eternal life? And so there in 26 he said, Jesus said to him, what is written in the law? How does it read to you? So it's important to note that the lawyer's asking what he can do. What can I do to inherit eternal life? And so then Jesus says, all right, well, if you're going to do something, what does the law say you should do? And so what is written in the law? How does it read? The lawyer's answer is to obey the greatest commandment from the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4. And so he says in verse 27, he answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you've answered correctly. Go do this and you shall live. So he, like Jesus, because Jesus in Matthew 22, he adds Leviticus onto the Shema. So Leviticus 19:18 is where it says to love your neighbor as yourself. And then to love the Lord your God, that is the Shema in Deuteronomy 6:4. So Jesus had tacked that on when he was asked the greatest commandment in Matthew. And so maybe this lawyer has been following him, and so he knew like Jesus answered, so he kind of gave it back because he knew what Jesus would answer. So he says, well, it's to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor. And Jesus says to him that he's answered correctly. And according to Jesus, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments, to love God and to love your neighbor. And I should put why, because, and Paul sums it up in Romans 13, I put 10, but I think it's 13:8. Someone can check me on that. I think it's 13:8. Paul sums it up that love does no wrong to a neighbor and thus fulfills the law. I'm just going to flip it because that's bothering me. What was I? Oh yeah, so 13:10. I'm thinking 13:8 is the one that we memorized. Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another, for he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. But 13:10 does say, love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. So I was all right. I did okay. You got to mark it out. You marked it out. I just put okay. That's what I did. So love is the fulfillment of the law. Because when you're loving, there's nothing that you're breaking, right? If you're loving God, then that means you're obeying the commandments. And if you're loving others, then that means you're loving God. And so love is the fulfillment. The lawyer, however, wishing to justify himself, asked, who is my neighbor? So there in verse 29, but wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? What does this question do in the lawyer's favor? Like, what's kind of strategic about this question? So he's a Jew, right? This is a lawyer, not like the lawyers that we have. These are like people who understand the Mosaic law, that law, not like an attorney lawyer. So he was well versed in the Mosaic law, the commandments, all the stuff what you should and shouldn't do.
Was he expecting Jesus to say, well, the fellow Jews, which would exclude being nice to the Romans and anybody else?
I think so. Because in that day, your neighbor was in proximity. It would have been your fellow countryman. And so by him saying, all right, so if I'm supposed to do this, because he said, if you do this, then you're good. You do this and you'll live. And so by asking the question, what he's doing is he's limiting the law's demand on him. So he's basically like, okay, that's pretty broad to love my neighbor, but if my neighbor is somebody that I already love, then I can do that. So he's narrowing or limiting the scope, or not the scope, but the demand of the law on him to fulfill it. And like I put there, a neighbor was viewed as a fellow Jew. And so Jesus, probably knowing and anticipating this question, him assuming that his neighbor is a Jew, that's how he understands the neighbor, Jesus now gives the parable. Jesus replied and said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers. And they stripped him and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. And by chance a priest was going down on the road. And when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him. And when he saw him, he felt compassion, and came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. And he put him on his own beast and brought him to an inn and took care of him. On the next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, take care of him, and whatever you spend, when I return, I will repay you. And then he asked, which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor who fell among the robbers? So, before we get going there, I would say, we always do this. We got our thing up here. Embodiment, design, so from what we've read, and I'll go ahead and read the end of it here, 36. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? And this is the lawyer, he replies, the one who showed mercy toward him. And Jesus said to him, go do the same. So from what we have here, from what Jesus has said, from what the context has given us, where would we put this on our spectrum? Embodiment. I think embodiment. I think this is like a pure embodiment. Jesus doesn't give any negation that someone represents something else. There's no symbolism going on here. There's no hints to like an Old Testament verse that Jesus quotes that would, like, if we go back and look at that, would kind of give more of a context into what things mean. So I think this is just embodiment straight up. He's telling a story that would then make a singular point, embody a singular truth or point to the listener.
He's making a point, but this may even be a true story he's telling, right?
Could be.
Could be.
So
Yeah.
when I was in 5th grade, I was in a school play, and I was the official business person that was the Good Samaritan, and I had my line was, Maxine, stop the limo. This man needs our help.
She went to a Christian school.
So I had to
was a
get out
public
and like
school.
help the good.
And I'm pretty sure this was like Pentecostal too, so there may have been a lot of acting going on.
Was it a musical by chance?
I
Because
believe there was.
we did that musical
involved.
at Sunnybrook when I was growing up.
Okay.
I remember the
You remember the line?
I remember the line, and I remember the songs and all. Very
We
good.
should have had you get together. You guys could have just
I
reenacted
think
that.
Just don't have me sing.
That would have been a good time killer.
A first solo.
Scratch the video for next week.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're getting video. You
There we
guys,
go.
you guys are performing. So this is not an allegorical parable. Is that last or mine? The neighbor is viewed as a Jew, not an allegorical parable. So this parable as a whole embodies a moral meaning or teaching. So
Oh, embodiment. I get it now. I didn't understand why it was called embodiment, but I do now.
Oh, because it embodies one meaning.
Thank you for that line.
Okay.
Put 'em-
Good.
Me without my drums.
Hi, Mom. Do it.
I said, me without my drums.
It's week 6. Yeah, so it embodies it's just a story that has a meaning. So the trip from Jerusalem to Jericho was 17 miles, and it descended 3,300 feet. So not only was it kind of treacherous in that the terrain, because you're in the mountains and you're going up to Jerusalem, and you've heard it before. That's why they always say you go up to Jerusalem or you go down, because it's on a mountain. And so you had to think of mountain peaks, and the road's on the mountain peaks, and that's how you get there. So it's pretty rough. And then of course, because it's 17 miles and people are traveling, and there's nothing really in between, you have the issue of thieves and stuff like that can rob people. So that's why when there were pilgrimages, they would go in large groups. All right, so priests officiated worship of God in Jerusalem. So the priest would have been a person who would have been the guy officiating the worship when someone would bring sacrifice or whatever it is that they needed to do to worship. He'd be the one to handle that. A Levite, so priests were of the Levites, but a Levite would have been somebody also who would have assisted the priest in their job. So both their role, they didn't do anything else. Levites and priests, their only role in life was worship. They didn't have farms, they didn't do any of that stuff. Their whole purpose as Levites was to conduct worship in Jerusalem. Yeah.
Back to verse 31. Was it legal for a priest to touch a body?
We're getting ready to get there.
Okay.
You've studied the Bible. So yeah, pass by on the other side means that they went out of their way. They saw it and they actively went around the person. And I say why, and the issue is ritual purity.
Okay.
So ritual purity issue is why the priest and the Levite would have gone around them. So we kind of talked about, I think it was last time, I can't remember. I've talked about how there's 2 types of impurities in the law. There's moral impurity and ritual impurity. Moral impurity, we're probably going to talk more about that in lesson 9, so I won't talk about too much about it, but moral impurity would have been inadvertent sins, things like that. And there's a whole code and rituals that one would have to go through to get right there. Ritual impurities didn't have anything to do with sin. It was more of coming into contact with dead bodies is going to be one we're going to talk about here in a minute. There were unclean foods.
So it was obeying the law. If you broke the law, you were ritually impure.
Would depend on the law. So there's different codes. So there's the food, right? So it's you can only have certain food, or there's unclean animals. So this is why you don't see swine or pigs in Jerusalem, because they were considered unclean. So there's no pigs in Israel. But if one came into contact, we'll see in the prodigal son, what does that mean? Well, they're now ritually impure. Now, under ritual impurities, there's minor impurities and there's major impurities. The Bible doesn't actually say minor or major, but we can kind of categorize them by the process a person would have to do for purification. And so I'll kind of talk about that real quick. So and there's a bunch of them, but so if there was a minor impurity thing that happened, there would be different combinations of bathing, sacrifices, and waiting till sundown. So there are some things you don't need to bathe or do a sacrifice, you just need to wait till sundown that day, and then the next day, because sundown for them was the next day. So as soon as the sun went down the next day, so then they'd have been good to go. Some did involve bathing, and then after sun went down the next day, they would go and then offer a sacrifice, like 2 doves or 2 pigeons, something like that. It's just different combinations. I'm just kind of trying to simplify it because it's, if you've read Leviticus, then you know that you're happy I'm simplifying it. Major impurities, this was a longer process. So this would involve a process involving 7 days, even up to 80 days in combinations of sacrifices. And bathing, I didn't put bathing, but bathing as well. So, like, if a woman had a baby, for 7 days, if it's a boy, she's ritually impure. And the reason is, it's not because she did anything wrong. These impurities have to do with coming into contact with blood. Because blood, remember, I think, the life of the flesh is in the blood. He says, I've given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your sins. So life is in the blood, so when the blood is spilled, there's death, right? So that's why when they do rituals, God is very specific on how you are to sacrifice an animal. And I won't get into that now. But even if you were to kill an animal as a sacrifice outside of Jerusalem, that would have been a big no-no. Because it's not following the code that God has given. Now that person is considered a murderer for killing an animal because he took a life, and the life is in the flesh. If you were hunting and you killed an animal to eat it, that was okay, but you had to pour the blood out onto the ground, and then you had to cover the blood, and then it'd be okay. If you did not cover the blood, then that was a big no-no. You'd be treated as if you were a murderer. So it's the issue about blood, because blood carries the life.
Covering the blood, what was that symbolizing?
I don't know. I just know that was like if you were hunting and you killed an animal, then you were to bleed it out right there onto the ground, but then you were to cover the blood, and that was the process of the sacrificial ritual that made it okay. But if you didn't cover the blood, and I don't know why. That might be good for something to look up, but it doesn't even say in Leviticus. It just says this is what you're to do. So like the woman who has a son, she's done nothing wrong, but in the birthing process, obviously there's blood. So she's come into contact with blood, so she's impure for 7 days. At the end of the 7 days, she's pure, but she has to wait 33 more days of this purification process. And I'll talk about that here in a minute, because it's kind of like, what? So the purification process didn't make anyone pure, which is kind of weird when you think about it. So, and we'll talk about it here down below under major impurities involving little living water. But if a woman was to have a female baby, she would be impure for 14 days, and then she would have to wait 66 days until the purification process was complete. So it's just different combinations of how a person who was ritually impure would become pure again. Remember the woman that was hemorrhaging for 12 years? She would have been major impurity because it was abnormal bleeding. So, but going on, major impurity involving living water purification. So if you came in and you touched a corpse, which I think the Levite and the priest, because it says the guy was beaten near death, so they probably saw him, instead of walking up and like, hey buddy, you okay, and touching him, they're like, he's dead. I can't touch him. So if they touched the guy beaten and he happened to be dead, then they would be impure, and it'd be a major impurity. And in this process, they would have to stay outside of the city, Jerusalem, for 7 days. On the 3rd day, they would have to take the ashes from the red heifer and mix it with living water. Living water just means running water. So there's like different types. And the best water, foreshadow, guess what the best water is? The running water. Who says they're the running water or the living water? Jesus. So that's fun. Anyway, we're not doing that though. So if a person comes into contact with a corpse, then that was the process. And so think about it, if you're a priest, and he's leaving Jerusalem, so his time may have been up, I don't know, because they worked in certain shifts. His time may have been up. I don't know why he's leaving, it doesn't tell us. But if he would have touched the body and it was dead, he would have had to have turned around and he would have had to go back. And for 7 days, he would have had to been back. So I don't know where he's going, but it would have interrupted and been a big inconvenience for him. Because then he's got to go back, hang out outside the city on the 3rd day wash, and then on the 7th day wash, and then on the 8th day, he would have had to give him a sacrifice, and then he's good to go, and now he can leave again. So that's probably what he's thinking. Same thing with the Levite. Now, if you touch an object that was touched by a dead person, then you would have to do kind of the same process, washing the object, whatever that is. The third one is...
How do you know if the object's been touched by a dead person?
Well, I mean, like, that guy's dead and I'm gonna take his sword
Oh,
or
okay,
something,
okay.
you know.
Yeah, but somebody that would do that really wasn't probably gonna care about rituals.
But, you know, honestly, if that was a thing, that soldier would have had to done the purification process anyway, because you read in Numbers where the soldiers did the same process where they had to stay outside the camp for 7 days, wash 3rd, 7th day as well, and then give a sacrifice on the 8th day. So he would have just been like, well, I guess when I bath, I'll just bathe the sword too. I don't know. That's what I would think. It was a cool sword.
Oh, hey, here, in answer to your question, in Leviticus, covering the blood of a slain animal is a divine command because blood represents the life force and soul of the animal. Pouring the blood onto the ground and covering it with earth signifies returning the animal's life to its creator, God, and not consuming it, which would be seen as consuming the very spirit of the creature.
Okay, thank you. Was that AI or was that Google?
It's your favorite source.
Was that Grok?
It's your girlfriend.
She's not my girlfriend. I just have a lot of questions. So skin disease would have been a major impurity, and there would have been a process too. That's different. Won't get into that one. And then you have abnormal genital discharge. It's like the woman who was hemorrhaging for 12 years, and then there was a process there. I didn't put it in the notes, but I thought it's just cool to learn this stuff. So I mentioned how the purification process didn't make a person pure. And so I'll talk about the skin disease one as an illustration. So if a person had skin disease, as long as they had that disease, they were impure. And there's nothing they can do about it. There's not an offering, there's nothing they can do, there's no bathing they can do to make themselves pure. So think about the lepers, right, in the Gospels. It's not like a leper could be like, oh, here's a sacrifice, I'm good. But, like if Jesus healed them, or for some reason they were healed, from the moment that the skin disease is gone, then they would start the process of purification. So the process of purification is kind of misleading how we describe it, but what that's doing is, I don't know why I'm writing, but I'm visual. So when someone goes impure, they go to the common. And then when they're healed, then the process brings them back to the holy. Or really better is sanctified. Sanctified is now they're used by God. Common is just common, right? That's everybody. So I think the best thing is like if we go to, we think of, remember Moses cut the covenant with Israel. So Exodus 19:5, we have this where it talks about he takes the blood of the covenant and he puts it on the altar. So on the altar, and then he puts it on the people. The blood of the covenant, that sacrifice was not a propitiatory sacrifice. So we know what propitiation is, right? Not paying for anyone's sins. The blood, though, what it does is, this represents God, and this is the people. So by putting the blood on the altar and then putting the blood on the people, it connects them. in this covenant relationship. And it's taken a common people and it's now made them a set apart people for his own possession. I'm trying to think all the places it talks about this. I'm gonna mess it up, so I'm not gonna try. Anyway, so when we talk about the blood of the covenant, it's not a propitiatory, it's not paying for sins. What it's doing is transformation. It's taking a common people and it's moving them over to a holy people, set apart for his own possession. So when you get to places in the New Testament, like Titus 2:11-14, where it talks about, I'd have to start, you know when you memorize something, you have to like start at the beginning or you don't know it. So I'm not gonna.
Purify for himself, people for his own possession.
Yeah.
Zealous for good deeds.
So when it's talking about that purification in that verse, we tend to automatically think propitiation, dying on the cross. Now, when he died on the cross, he did a lot of fulfilling of the Old Testament, all of it. I think he fulfilled every type of sacrifice there, which includes the propitiation, right? We know that. He's a satisfactory payment for not only our sins, but the sins of the whole world. But when in this particular verse, I think what Paul has in mind is this, the blood of the new covenant, that he is purified, not paid for, but he's purified for himself, a people for his own possession to do good works. He's sanctified, set us apart. And so when we think of the purification process, how Jesus purified us from sinful people or whatever, common people, and he's purified us and made us people for his own possession. It's the same language in the Old Testament of God and his people. He's already redeemed them out of Egypt, right? They're his people. Now he's transforming them into his own possession. And so as things went along, people who are his possession to do good works and be sanctified and set apart, holy, come into these situations where maybe they're no longer pure or holy. They move back to the common, right? And so the law and these ritual processes was to bring them, transform them back into the holy. Does that make sense? So that's why there's all these laws and purification stuff.
So then all Jews were raised to consider themselves better than everybody else in the world because they weren't a Jew.
I don't think initially they were. But what happened was Paul talks about how they became conceited because they're like, we have the covenants, we're descendants of Abraham, we have the covenant, we have all these things, these gifts from God.
Because Abraham didn't act that way, but the Pharisees and Levites and all those people of Jesus' time.
Yeah, so going back to Exodus right there, it talks about how they're to be set apart and to be a holy nation and a kingdom of priests. So a kingdom of priests, right, that's what we're called, right, in 1 Peter chapter 2. Kingdom of priests, what is a priest's function? They're a mediator, they're a go-between. So the nation of Israel was set apart for his possession, not to be like, oh, we're good and you all stink, Gentiles, but to be a light to the Gentiles. They were to be a nation that functioned in between God and the world. And so through their weird customs of their hair, you know, they could only wear like certain things with tassels and their hair. They couldn't shave this part, so they had the weird, curls. I don't know what curls. Yeah, all that was to be like, look how weird these people are. To draw attention to them. To draw attention to them, right? Because that's what being set apart is. You're different. So not only were God's people to be set apart in how they live, but he strategically made them look different. So that way when the nation saw them, they wouldn't confuse them with anyone else. They would know those are God's people. But, like you're saying, what happened was instead of being a kingdom of priests, they ended up just being a kingdom that was inward focused and conceited. Because we're the chosen ones. And that's why I'm not going to hate on Reformed people because I have friends that are Reformed, but it's very easy for, especially people in Reformed theology that have become theologians or pastors, to get hemmed into this and they don't realize it. But if you look at their tweets, it's like, that's kind of arrogant. But because they think they're the chosen, right? They're God's elect. And so then sneaks in this conceit and this arrogance. So, and I don't Yeah, I don't think that's what it's about, but yeah, so kingdom priests, that's what their function was to do, to be set apart as God's own possession, to be a holy nation in a kingdom of priests, so that the way the world would see the light and come and worship the true God. But they failed at that. Interestingly enough, that's why Matthew, if you look at the prophecies that Jesus is fulfilling in Matthew,
Who's wanting me?
it's fine. I'm off my game on comedic relief tonight. So,
It's okay, I text Brian about the air, it's dropped 3 degrees.
oh, good. You guys know Brian can control that with his phone?
He told me, so.
Okay, so now we know. Text Brian, and I want to be like, Brian, why is your phone out while you're teaching?
Because Heidi's texting him.
No, every Sunday from the stage with the lights.
Brian, turn it down. That explains why we see it drop.
Oh, you're the problem?
It is murderous.
I sit there and I watch it
Yeah,
over there.
and we're always like, this place is full. It's like 600 people here. How is it getting colder? Should it getting
I'm
hotter?
gonna be bringing blankets to
We're all gonna be looking at her on Sunday morning.
Look at Max. Max is very cold natured.
He's freezing up there.
Freezes up there.
Oh,
He wears like
That's why he always wears his.
Until the
long
service
sleeves.
starts.
Yep, all the time. Mm-hmm. Like Max.
Well, now all these mysteries are being made known.
freezing.
I could bring it to you.
But he's
Wear a
freezing at
jacket,
like
man.
78.
Yes, you're
It's
right.
cold.
Does anybody know what I was talking about?
No, your mom's
No
phone
idea.
went off.
You were saying something about
Oriented,
Baptist.
Sanctification, purification, the process. Okay. The law would then limit compassion. So that the point there is, this priest, he might have good intentions, right? He might not be a bad guy. He's just like, I'm not going to take the chance because the law says if I touch him and he's dead, then I've got to turn back around and I've got a whole week that I didn't plan of trying to get pure again, so that way I can be ready to do the temple services. That's his job. So it's
Or a whole week before I get home and I don't
Or-
have money
yeah.
to feed myself.
right, because he could have been done. He could have been headed home. So it would have been a big inconvenience if he stopped to help this guy and he ended up being dead and he touched him. So because of that, then we could say that the law is limiting compassion, right? Because what would the right thing be to do to help? So I have this thing that I call the Jesus hermeneutic, and it's when the law or its interpretation harms, a person remains innocent though he or she breaks it to help a life. Does that make sense? So I just said you could break the law, and that's not. I'm not saying you should break the law or God's commandments. And I give Matthew 12 there as an example where they're eating on the Sabbath, they're gleaning, and the Pharisees say you can't do that, you can't work on the Sabbath. Because they had interpreted the law to mean you couldn't do that, even though under the law you actually could. But their interpretation of the law was so strict that they said you're breaking the law. And Jesus is basically like, hey, we're not breaking the law, but I'm going to help your stupid argument. I'm going to actually give you a law that we are breaking, or that a law was broken. And so he tells the story about David. Remember, David was on the run, and this is when the temple was at Shiloh, and he goes in, and what do? They ate the showbread. Can't eat the showbread unless you're a priest. But David and his men ate the showbread. Why were they innocent of breaking that? Because the law is given for life, to protect life. The law is given to reveal God's character. But when the law no longer functions the way the law was intended, then the law has become void. Does that make sense?
Like protecting the spies, like lying.
You could argue that, because people have a big issue. I had no idea how many people hung up about whether it's okay to lie or not. You know that whole Rahab story. We're not going to get into that. But what you see Jesus tell the Pharisees there is, hey, David did this, but why is David not guilty of breaking the law? And we're going to see why here in a minute at the end of this. So who is the priest's neighbor? The man. This man. Who is the Levite's neighbor? This man.
Oh, because he was a Jew.
Yeah, he's a Jew. Then it says, then I put, who is the Samaritan's neighbor? Not this man. According to this guy's definition, the lawyer. So the lawyer's definition is my fellow neighbor is a Jew. You see fellow Jews not helping this Jew. But then you see a Samaritan who's not a Jew, who's not his neighbor, proved to be his neighbor. So who proved to be this Jew's neighbor? The Samaritan. And then he asked in verse 37, the one who, he asked who proved to be the neighbor, and he says in verse 37, the one who showed mercy. So it's because of mercy that he is the neighbor. And in two places, in Matthew 9 and 12, Jesus quotes Hosea 6:6, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And that's the heart that I was getting to about the Jesus principle. What God cares about is mercy and compassion, not sacrifices. He cares about the sacrifices when they're done with a heart that is his heart. But so many times God gets on his people because their festivals and their sacrifices, they mean nothing to him because their heart's not with his heart. They don't care about him. They're just going through the motions. And that was their form of worship. And so our worship shouldn't just be like we're showing up on a Sunday morning, checking the box. It shouldn't be, well, we're just doing this because that's what we were raised up to do. We should be coming to church because this is where we worship. Now we worship as a lifestyle, but this is that time where we come and gather together and worship corporately as a group, right? As the body of Christ. And we always have to have a heart check in my car on the way to church, don't we?
It's like fight hour.
It's like, hey, we all need to chill out, all right? And
it's usually fighting over Bible, who gets to say their Bible verses.
Yeah.
I'm like, I love that you guys are learning the Bible.
That's Wednesday night.
Oh.
But Sunday morning it's more of a, I don't really want to go and have to be like, hey, do you think Jesus wanted to go to the cross? That usually shuts them up. All right. But it's real easy to go through your week and then kind of get off track, and it's like, okay, now it's Sunday, now we're going to do this, and our heart might not be there, and maybe we're just forgetting that we're coming to respond to God for what he's done for us. But sometimes we come in like, well, I wish the music was this way, or I wish the temperature was this way.
Both of those things are my fault now, so.
Not saying anything. Anyway, I'm just saying that sometimes it's easy to forget the heart behind the worship, and that's what God cares about. And so that's just corporate worship, but a lifestyle of worship, right? Our lives are to be a life of worship. We're living sacrifices, Romans 12:1 and 2, sorry. And so as we live, our lives are supposed to be a living sacrifice to him, a living act of worship. And so we should have heart checks throughout our day. Why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we, are we being kind because it looks good, or are we being kind because it's the right thing to do, right? That's just some examples. I don't know. Okay. So the point of the parable is love for others can't be limited. So when Jesus says love your neighbor as yourself, we can't limit that by picking who we want to love. Your neighbor is not limited by proximity, and mercy is not limited by rules/law or convenience. Any questions? I do a lot of checks. Ritual.
I would go back and listen to that again. So, not there yet.
Well, we have time if you have a question.
No, I'm good.
Go back and watch it and get confused again and then call me. But as far as the parable goes, do we understand what the teaching of the parable is?
Maybe you may have said this, I may have missed it, but the Samaritan wasn't under the law because of not being a Jew,
Say
right?
that again, Samaritan.
The Samaritan didn't have to worry about the
The purity of-
purification.
They had their own law that they followed. So I'm not real sure how closely I think they only Well, if they did have the first 5, then that Leviticus would have been under Deuteronomy and Numbers. But yeah, I thought about that too. I was like, is it because he's free and not have to worry about the process? Now, because their place of worship was in Samaria, if they were going to follow the law, then he would have to go up to Samaria and spend 7 days outside of.
We don't know if that happened or not.
I don't know.
Some
I don't know.
material to this.
Yeah, I don't know much about the details of their worship. I know that it was like a hybrid of the law and stuff, because they had changed some stuff over the years.
But the point is, it should not have made a difference to the priest and the Levi,
Yeah,
because it didn't, okay.
the point is compassion is what God desires, and mercy is what he desires. And that's why Jesus says, passion, mercy, I desire, not burnt offerings or sacrifices. And again, that's, when you look at Hosea, that's the issue there, and that's why I think Jesus quotes that. That was, so yeah, I think that's why I said the priest and the Levite, you can understand why they went around. But I think what Jesus is wanting this Jew to understand is like their compassion was limited by the law, and it shouldn't have been. They should have helped a person in need, regardless of how that affects them or how it affects them, like their convenience, whether they've been convenient or not. There's a lot of times I think we can help people who are like, I gotta be somewhere,
So does their interpretation of the law fit into that statement that you just made?
The Samaritans or the Jews?
Their compassion was limited by the law.
I don't think they would have understood it that way, because the law was held to a high standard and degree. That's why the Pharisees were so strict about their interpretations of the law and creating traditions of man, because they were so concerned about not breaking the law. They made laws around the law to keep them from breaking the law. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Several.
Yes.
Like over 600.
Yeah, probably more. There's 613 commandments, so who knows how many interpretations, different interpretations they had of those commandments in order not to break those commandments. So, but I think Jesus, because this is a embodiment parable, and it's embodying principle, and the principle that he's getting at is that loving one's neighbor comes down to mercy and compassion, not convenience and not
Adherence.
well, not like, I use the law here, but also his definition of neighbor was cultural. So the culture said your neighbor is your fellow Jew and no one else. And Jesus is trying to say, no, your neighbor is any other human being. And he uses the Samaritan as kind of I don't know if it's a shock factor or an insult, that this very Samaritan would have compassion on a Jew when a fellow Jew. The lawyer in the story is probably placing himself not as a Samaritan. He probably sees himself as a Levite. And so he'd be like, yeah, I would have gone around too. But then at the end stress is like, well, who actually proved to be the neighbor? He's like the one that showed mercy. And Jesus is like, well, now you got it. Go do the same.
Yeah, he couldn't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan.
Yeah. All right. The next one is the midnight friend. This is in the next chapter, starting in verse 5, it goes through 13. So the disciples want to be taught how to pray, is how this starts in chapter 11. It happened that while Jesus was praying in a certain place, after he had finished, one of his disciples said to him, Lord, teach us to pray just as John also taught his disciples to pray. So this is the lead in, so we know the parable is going to be about prayer. And so in verse 2, Jesus teaches them how to pray. He said to them, when you pray, say, Father, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us our sins, for we ourselves also forgive everyone who has indebted to us, or who is indebted to us, and lead us not into temptation. So we're more familiar with this in Matthew, right? This didn't sound right. It kind of sounded a little, because Matthew, it gives the reading that we probably heard growing up or recited as kids or in church if you're coming out of a different denomination. So this is more of a condensed version of it than you find in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. So then he says, this is how you pray, and then verse 5 says, then he said to them, so he's going to give the parable. Suppose one of you has a friend and goes to him at midnight and says to him, friend, lend me 3 loaves, for a friend of mine has come to me from a journey, and I have nothing to set before him. And from inside he answers and says, do not bother me, the door has already been shut, and my children and I are in bed. I cannot get up and give you anything. I tell you, even though he will not get up and give him anything because he is his friend, yet because of his persistence, he will get up and give him as much as he needs. So that's the parable. Short one. Again, I don't think this parable, I think like the last, this is to be taken not in any allegorical sense. I think this parable is embodiment as well. It's going to embody a teaching on prayer. So I don't think the visitor represents anybody. I don't think the guy who shut the door is inside for the night represents anybody or anything. I don't think the shutting of the door is representative of being shut out of heaven. I don't think any of that. I think this is just a story, a quick story that embodies a moral teaching or meaning. See, I told you I was going to get mixed up. He's front and back. So hospitality, and we've talked about it before, hospitality in the ancient Near East was like near sacred. It wasn't like in the law, like this is how you're supposed to behave, but it was, the custom was, it was very shameful if you had a guest and you showed no hospitality to them. So this friend has no food to serve his unexpected guest. So what he does is he runs to his neighbor or to another friend at probably a late hour, asking for food. And this friend has no food to serve his unexpected guest. So this would have also been shameful, right? Because he's got this guest and he has nothing to give him. I've got no food. You've just come from a long journey and I've got nothing for you. So that would have been seen as shameful. And then you see the door has been shut. So we've talked about it before in the parable when the door is shut. But here, was it last week I talked, about how it was like during the day they left the doors open because they didn't have AC, and that's why the woman, that sinner lady, came in and cried all over Jesus' feet. And that's why it wasn't super weird, is because the doors would have been open, and during meals like that, people would come in around the room to listen and maybe get some scraps.
I think a good illustration is how Jaya would just walk into our house with like food or chai tea for you or something.
So
and then
but it's an illustration of why it would be awkward now.
But she's culturally different, so that's okay.
So
there.
Our neighbor, she doesn't do it as much anymore. But she would just walk in with like Indian food. So it was like you couldn't get mad. It was like, it smells really good, thank you. Or like one morning before church, she like showed up with like actual Indian tea that she had made, because I had talked to her like a couple days before about like, oh, I'd really like to try like authentic Indian tea. And so she thought, well, Sunday morning I'll show up. So I don't know. Anyway, she's a lovely person, great neighbor, very kind. But yeah, it's not awkward for her to just walk in my house. So the whole shutting the door concept was a little foreign to her. But
she got us a doorbell.
Yeah.
She actually.
Yeah, she did. I don't know what that means. Anyway, so he was good. Yeah, it was good.
If she doesn't watch this video.
I hope she does watch it. Thanks, Jay. So, because the doors were open all day, when the door was shut, that was a definite sign, like, we're done. We're in for the night. It's the definite sign, do not disturb. And so, everybody would have known that. The door's shut, don't go bother them. They're in for the night. And I had read somewhere, I can't remember, so I'm not gonna really get into it, but I do remember something about the process of shutting the door would have been, like, it was kind of a hassle. And it talks about how, like, he mentions how my children and I are in bed, like, everybody probably slept in the same room. So, like, to get up would have been to, like, kind of disturb and wake up the family. And if you've ever had little kids and they're asleep, it's precious. Do not wake them up, because then they're not precious. Especially when they're tired and hungry. Anyway, I digress. So, the friend, he's coming shamelessly, because it says in verse 8, it says, I tell you, even though he will not get up and give him anything because he is his friend, yet because of his persistence, because of the guy knocking on the door, his persistence, he will get up and give him as much as he needs. The word persistence kind of causes problems because it means shameless. He's coming shamelessly. And so trying to put what does it mean to be shameless and persistent together is kind of what we're going to try and do. And so the friend is coming shamelessly to the man. The friend feels no shame in coming, shameless, begging for bread, right? That would have been kind of shameful though, because what is he saying? He's saying, I'm a terrible guest. I've got nothing, so I'm not a great host. So by me coming to you, I'm admitting, you're seeing that I'm not a good host. I'm lacking hospitality for a guest. But he is risking that and counts that as not shameful because of his humility, because he knows he needs to come knock in order to actually be the good host. So the friend has humility to embarrass himself in order to avoid the shame of being inhospitable. So does that kind of make sense? Why he's coming shamelessly? The friend has humility to embarrass himself. Have you ever been embarrassed and just had to kind of eat it, you know? Just swallow your pride and just be like, that happened. And that takes humility to handle that embarrassment. He has the humility to embarrass himself with his neighbor by saying, I got no bread for a guest. But he's willing to do that. He has the humility to approach his friend to request over and over the bread, because in doing that, if the request is answered, then he now avoids the greater shame of actually being inhospitable. So it takes humility to do the right thing, and this is why the man answers the door. I'm not sure I like that. I thought I went back and changed it, but he answers the door because, not just because of his humility, but because his humility brought him to a place where he didn't care about the embarrassment. He cared so much about being hospitable. He's like, I gotta help this guy out. And because of his persistence, so that's how I'm connecting persistence with shamelessness, is that he had so much humility that he did not count it as shameful. It allowed him to be persistent in his request and knocking. He wouldn't leave the guy alone. So the guy ends up getting up and giving him whatever he needs, as it says in verse 8. So then Jesus goes on, and he says in verse 9, so I say to you, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened. So we have a threefold repetition of ask, seek, knock, and this emphasizes, I think, approaching God prayerfully. I don't think each one specifically has a certain meaning. I think they're all three saying the same thing in three different ways to be emphatic or emphasizing how we approach God in prayer. We ask, we seek, we knock. The knocking obviously is tying back into this guy who's knocking in the parable. He's knocking on the door. So those are the blanks. Ask and receive, seek and find, knock and it will be opened. And so then this leads to the question, does God always give us what we ask? Like if we just, I'm not going away, God, just keep knocking. Will he eventually just give up and give in to our requests? Because some people take this parable that way, but if you've ever walked with Jesus long enough, you know that's not how the game's played. So the answer is no. God does not always give us what we ask. He does always give us what we need. I get that from verse 8. It says that he will give him as much as he needs. And what is for our good, James 1:8. Every good thing given comes from above, from the Father of lights. No shadow shifting. So everything good is given to us for our good. And I think that's kind of hard, right? Because we've had those prayers that we really wanted to go a certain way, and either God said no or he said not right now. But it's not like we get a clear no or not right now. You know, if God was like, not right now, I'd be like, all right, I'll check back in later. You know, but we don't know. It's just one of the two. It's either a no or a not right now if it's not the yes. And so that's why I think we always be persistent, because it's not like he says no. Eventually we find out the no, and then we can stop being persistent and we can start asking a different prayer now that we have that answer. Now we know how to pray better. But I think we've all in here probably have walked with Jesus long enough, had a relationship with God enough to know that that's kind of how the prayer life works. I was asked a long time ago, why do we pray? Like, why pray if he's just going to do whatever he wants? If I have a request A, and he's going to answer it or not answer it, however he seems, why ask it at all? And this is college, so everyone wants to get in that free will for knowledge debate. And I don't know if this is a good answer, but this is what I said. I said, if you have a prayer request and you don't ask it, but God answers it, how is there any glory given to God, and how is your faith built up in any way? But if you have a request and maybe he doesn't answer it, right? Okay. But if you ask that and then he answers it, now your faith is built, and now people can see how God answers your prayer, and you build the faith of others. Does that kind of make sense? So I don't have all the answers to God and why he does what he does, and how he operates with our free will and his foreknowledge and his sovereign plan and all the different stuff. I don't know. He's too big, and the longer I study the Bible, the more I just say, like, I have no clue. He's just too big. But that's one thing I say. I think God wants us to be persistent in our prayer, because he's going to answer it the way he's going to answer it, and it's going to be what we need, and it's going to be for our good. And if people know that we're praying people, and they see, well, it may not have turned out how they wanted it, but now look how their faith is pivoting towards this answer that they didn't want, and look how they're praying now, and then look how God is answering those prayers. I just think prayer is powerful, not just